Shalom, my friends. Returning to our study in Galatiyim, commonly known as Galatians. Now with chapter 2, this video should be fairly quick. Chapter 2 is pretty direct. When we get to chapters 3, and especially 4 and 5 and 6, I'll have a lot to say. Those will be a little more complicated. But let's go ahead with chapter 2. Then, after 14 years, I again went up to Yerushalayim with Barnabas, taking Titus along too. And I went up by revelation, and laid before them that good news which I proclaim among the Gentiles, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Yahwanite, was compelled to be circumcised. But as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Mashiach Yeshua, in order to enslave us, to these we did not yield in subjection, not even for an hour, so that the truth of the good news remains with you. But from those who were esteemed to be what they were, it makes no difference to me. Elohim shows no partiality. For those who were esteemed contributed naught to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the good news to the uncircumcised had been entrusted to me, even as Kepha to the circumcised, for he who worked in Kepha to make him an emissary to the circumcised also worked in me for the Gentiles. The circumcised, of course, being the Yahudim, and the uncircumcised being the non-Yahudim, the Gentiles. I always say, with the word Gentiles, you could replace that with all the nations on the earth, except for Yisrael. Because, back in Bereshit, Genesis, after the Tower of Babel, the Father divorced himself from everyone on earth, gave them over to 70 different languages, and gave them over to worshiping 70 fallen malachim, false messengers of darkness. And then he went on to create his own nation. That's where he grabs up Abraham, Avraham, and eventually creates his own nation, Yisrael. So Yisrael becomes the Father's chosen nation, his chosen people. And all the other nations on earth are not his. He divorced himself from all of them. That's what the Gentiles are. And of course here, through Shaul, all the other nations are given the opportunity to become adopted in. Verse 9. So when Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan, who seemed to be supports, came to know the favor that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, with purpose of we unto the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised, only that we might remember the poor, which I myself was eager to do. And when Kepha had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was at fault. Again, Kepha is referring to Peter. And Shaul, who's writing this, that's commonly known as Paul, but those Peter and Paul were not their names. Verse 12, he says, "For before some came from Yaakov." Now here, what he's referring to is he's saying that before some came from Yaakov, from Jerusalem to Antioch. For before some came from Yaakov in Jerusalem to Antioch, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself in fear of those of the circumcision. And the rest of the Yahudim, that's the word for Jews, and the rest of the Yahudim joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they are not walking straight according to the truth of the good news, I said to Kepha, before them all, if you, being a Yahudi, live as a Gentile and not as the Yahudim, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Yahudim? We, Yahudim by nature and not of the Gentiles, sinners, knowing that a man is not declared right by works of Torah, but through belief in Yeshua HaMashiach, even we have believed in Mashiach, Yeshua, in order to be declared right by belief in Mashiach and not by works of Torah. Because by works of Torah no flesh shall be declared right. It's good to remind yourself, when you hear the word Torah, it does not mean law. It's good to get that notion out of your head, because to think of the Torah as a law that, if you break the law, you get punished. The word Torah means teaching. I have another video about the Torah. You might want to dig into that. But Torah is basically, it means that the Father's instructions. And the way that I see it is, these are the Father's teachings or instructions for us to know how to keep the enemy at bay. The Torah is not a matter of laws. Okay, if you don't do this, you're going to get punished. Or like, the second commandment, thou shalt not make or bow down to engraven images. That's not the Father saying, look, if you make or bow down to engraven images, you're going to make me angry and I'm going to punish you. It's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, don't make or bow down to engraven images, because that opens doors for demonic control in your life. That opens doors for demonic strongholds. That opens doors for the enemy to exercise rights over you, because if you make or bow down to engraven images, you're saying that you're worshiping something other than Elohim, and you're not getting punished for disobeying the law. You're inviting darkness and trouble into your life for doing things that invite darkness and trouble. And the Torah is the Father's instruction about how to avoid such things. And also, by adopting that attitude, that the Torah is a law, and if you obey it, then you don't get punished. That's how people, even way back then, fall into what Shaul is talking about here. That we're not saved by works, because they started acting as though Torah meant law, and if they obey the law, then they can't be punished. And they started worshiping this thing called law and their works, instead of looking at the Torah as the Father's loving instruction. I hope you can see the difference. And that's really what Shaul is trying to point out. But even today, people take that and they turn it into another law and into another form of misunderstanding, and even like a cult, you know. It's like, we're not saved by works, if I saved by faith alone. You know, yeah, that's true, but there's a misunderstanding delivered when it's delivered that way. My other video about the Torah may explain that more so. If not, I may have to do another video focusing on that alone, and maybe I will. Verse 17, and if, while seeking to be declared right by Mashiach, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Mashiach then a servant of sin? Let it not be. For if I rebuild what I overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. For through Torah, I died to Torah in order to live to Elohim. I have been impaled with Mashiach, and I no longer live, but Mashiach lives in me. And that which I now live in the flesh, I live by belief in the bane of Yahweh, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not put aside the favor of Elohim, for if righteousness is through Torah, then Mashiach died for naught. That's the end of chapter 2. Again, you know, he's still saying the same thing. If righteousness is through Torah, the Torah, you know, what he's talking about here is this misunderstanding that was going on, like I said, even back then. That the Torah is laws, not teachings. Laws. You break them, you get punished. And that turned into, you know, obey these laws, and you make yourself righteous. And they started getting into works. A lot of people still do that today. Through, you know, I think I mentioned it in the previous video on chapter 1. Where people say, oh, you know, you have to be baptized or you're not saved. That's that same, this is just what Shaul's talking about here. If I say, you know, you have to be baptized or you're not saved, now we're getting into, it's, you know, I can't say it's the Torah because the Torah doesn't, you know, talk about baptism that way. But they're talking about it like a law, and of course they took the word Torah and the idea of the Father's Torah and turned it into law. And that's just what goes on. If somebody says, you know, if you're not baptized, then you're not saved. Oh, now there's this law. You have to be baptized. That's the law. Or you're not saved. And that, of course, says that what Yeshua did is worthless. What he did can't save you. You have to be baptized. That's pointing at works. And this is what Shaul is trying to get them to understand. It's what, you know, people like myself and hopefully yourself are trying to get others to understand even today. People get caught up in works. People want to worship themselves. People want to worship a man. They want to follow someone. Well, there's only one man to follow, and that's Yeshua. And he doesn't even want you to worship him. You know, he said, I didn't come to glorify myself. I came to glorify the Father. It's the Father who is to be worshipped. And the Torah, it's not just the 10 Commandments, it's the first 5 books, which me and the HalleluYah Scriptures team will be releasing in audio format here in a couple of months or so. It's the first 5 books. It's filled with the Father's instructions about His love for those whom He will call His, for those who have a heart for Him and not a heart for the world. If someone has a heart for the world, they have a heart for laws and for works. Why? Works. That esteems the person. Look what I did. I'm righteous because I did A, B, C, and D. I got saved because I got baptized. It's pointing at esteeming oneself instead of esteeming the Father, and that's crazy, although it seems to me more often the case than not. There's chapter 2, short and sweet this week. Look below this video, you'll see a link to a radio show that I'll be doing with Lee on Blow the Shofar Radio, where we'll be talking about these things in greater depth. And if we're taking phone calls, you can call in and ask questions, and we'll answer them for you. So there's chapter 2 in Galatiyim. Shalom, my friends.